So as a Rams fan, I'm a little disappointed this morning.
It was a good game
That
though.
was.
It was a good game, though they just let them march down and score at the end. They didn't even like,
Yeah, no.
I mean, I have Montgomery on my fantasy team, so I wasn't too upset, but
I'm
and
just
Cup.
Still, like, I'm kind of looking a grade at the fourth quarter because like, if you didn't do those two fouls, offensive fouls, I was like, we could have gone that way.
I know, it was a good game though. I really like Cooper Cup's one of my favorite. And I drafted him in all my leagues, so I was happy with his scores.
The got injured.
I know. He started injured, which is why I was like, you know, you draft.
Good call though.
I know, well, we'll see if he stays healthy. Did everyone have a good weekend?
Yeah.
Yeah, feels like it went fast. It was so hot. It was so miserably hot. I think it's today and then a little bit tomorrow. And then I don't know if you saw, but then it's like 80. But
Yeah,
which
it's
is starting to look really nice. Normally 80, I'm like, that's still hot, but right now 80 is looking like really good. So I'm excited for like 2 more days. I wanted to put my Halloween lights up on my house outside, but not in 108, 6, whatever degrees. Nothing. Oh, so we have like 2 thoughts to wrap up with chapter 3 and then your homework assignment that I gave you. And then we'll move on to chapter 4, which is super exciting. So what I want to do, I want to give you just a couple of minutes. So find a couple of people around you. And hopefully we'll have a few people join us here in a minute. But find a few people around you and just kind of share your thoughts. What were your reactions to the excerpt from the article that you read? And then we'll talk about it together for a minute and I'll collect it. So just with a couple of people, chat about it for a couple of minutes and then we'll go from there.
Everybody's going to have their own conflict.
Give you like 2 more minutes and then we'll talk about it together.
Oh, sure.
I sent it on to you. Did you read it? Oh, and it's sent out to you now. We talked about So unfortunately, we reflected into a few others, but usually do a lot. So, yeah, you don't like bring talk about it anymore. So, yeah. Or that. Can we talk about it in class? And I sent it out over my house and spoke this up. Yeah. Yep. Oh, no, sorry.
It's like we're like shady degrees. But that's why I was comparing this story to those products as well as reading. Yeah, I'm like my brain's so like battery and it's barely.
seems like you kind of stopped the, so maybe let's talk about it for a minute and I'll collect it from you. As I mentioned, I wanted to give you a very different perspective. This is a very different perspective than like the mainstream idea that we have diagnoses, that we have mental illness, that these are all things that we recognize. And it's old, right? This is something from back in like the 1950s, 1960s. Though he did kind of write an article readdressing his thoughts, which were very similar just a couple of years ago. So it is something that he has continued to maintain. What do you think? Do you agree with him? Disagree with him? Or say no? Right. So why not? Like what were
I
your
think
thoughts?
this it's like, because he went on a tangent about how like it's the person that has to always work on themselves, but it's like sometimes that's not always the case, like. And at least until when I submitted it for Canvas, like one of the point of views I gave is like when I worked in downtown LA for 10, 12 years, like. You can just tell when people like. Let's say it's gone to a point where it's like no man's land kind of thing, and I'm like, whoa, like to say that like, oh, it's the individual problem now, it's like, no,
Okay.
no, it's like. Sometimes you have to have people to intervene, basically.
So you could kind of see when it's gone beyond what is like normal or typical, like we use quotes for those words, right? Normal and typical to mental illness, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what you're saying. Okay, other thoughts? I mean, you don't have to disagree or agree 100% either way, right? Also, you can maybe see points of it, but other thoughts about what he had to say? Anybody else? Well, anyone else agree? Anyone think that maybe he had a good point, even if it wasn't like 100% at all? Not seeing anyone nod, right? So a lot of disagreement, I'm assuming. Again, like a very different perspective, but there are some good things about diagnosing people. As we talked about last time, if you diagnose someone, you know what they have, so you know you can help them with. But sometimes diagnoses can be really like negative. Anyone have any comments here about like how a diagnosis might harm you or help you in some way? Yeah, thanks.
I noted that some people may become dependent on their diagnosis.
Yeah.
And feel disempowered to make changes in their lives.
Sure. Yeah, and like sometimes when you receive a diagnosis, it can be really like detrimental, right? It might make you feel almost resigned in a way, or you could kind of accept it as your reality. I've definitely had I had a client who was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder when she was a teenager. Now it's a really stigmatized diagnosis, right? And it came to kind of define her. And then when she got a little bit older, she went back to therapy, and it was a different diagnosis that they gave her, but it took her forever to let go of it, right? And it was like, no, this is who I am, right? It almost became like her defining characteristic. And then getting a different diagnosis, there was like a freedom in that, but hard to let go of. Sometimes these can make it really challenging. And so I think that's one thing that I kind of like that he's addressing, but it feels like such an opposite. And again, that was important to me that you know that not everybody agrees with this kind of mainstream idea that we have, that mental illness is diagnosable, recognizable, and like consistent across cultures, across places. Any other thoughts, whether it was like about what he had to say or kind of your own thoughts? Anything else here before I collect them from you? Yeah.
This is quite what you said. Really good.
Yeah,
And I just love them.
right. Yeah, right. It's kind of a bold thing to say in a kind of shocking way. I would agree with you, right? And as I mentioned, I think very different perspective, and some of it old, but he still maintained this. I think it was 2018 that he wrote like a follow-up to it. So 6 years ago, he was like, yeah, I maintain my still maintain thought. Anybody else yet?
I would say that it could hinder some people in somewhere. Because they'll prescribe something and it usually leads to addiction, and also how you said like people like get stuck with that label and pick it up as a whole personality, which like could lead them to need sympathy from others. But realistically, it's like their own battle, but it doesn't even need to be a battle, I want to say. But I don't know, I had one more thought and escaped.
Yeah, it's early, right? I understand, right? But thank you, right? And I agree. I think that's a great, I like where you were going with that, right? So if it comes back, you put it together. Okay, if you wanna make sure your name is on there, go ahead and pass those up to me, and then we have one last slide and then we will move on. Move on.
And then, that's right,
On campus. Yeah, I thought, thank you.
I just have to double check this.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Anyone? Okay. So last thought, so we have gone through all of that assessment. We've arrived at a diagnosis. Remember those diagnostic, kind of things that we put up on the board where you can describe what somebody has, that additional information, the severity. The last thing we do is kind of try to decide on a treatment. And what you'll see as we go through the different disorders is that there are certain better for each disorder, right? And so each model, all these models that we talked about in the last chapter, typically once we have a disorder, we can kind of look at it in a couple of different ways. And depending on what we think are the influencing factors, those often dictate treatment. And you'll see that as we get into anxiety disorders today. And in general, regardless of what treatment we pick, therapy, right, whatever modality it might be, does generally show to be helpful, right? Like 2/3 of the time, therapy tends to be helpful. Now, there are a couple of caveats to that. It has to be that you have some degree of motivation to change. If you go into therapy and you're like, I don't want to get better, I'm never going to get better, I'm not going to do any effort, I don't care, it's probably not going to be all that helpful, right? But if you have at least a little bit of motivation, which might be lacking depending on what disorder you have, but if you have some motivation, it tends to be a positive factor. And people who have access to the therapy that they need tend to do better than those who don't, right? So for example, let's say your insurance only covers 5 sessions, but you need 50, right? That can be a huge barrier, right? And so for some people, therapy access is the most prominent barrier more than anything. Also, people who have milder issues over more severe ones tend to have more success. And as I mentioned, certain types of therapy tend to be better for certain types of problems. And our kind of main modality that we use now is to be really eclectic, right? So a little bit of everything, depending on what's going on for somebody. So at this point, once we've kind of talked about all of that, we have talked about how the past, right? We've talked about what's normal versus abnormal. We went over all the models and then how we assess and diagnose. So now we get to get into the disorders, which is usually the reason that people are excited about abnormal psychology. So we get to start with anxiety disorders today. And I feel like I'm oddly excited to talk about anxiety disorders, but we're in the disorders, right? And that's fun. But these are by a mile the most common disorders that people struggle with. Anxiety plagues a lot of people, followed by mood disorders. So this is the most common group of disorders by quite a bit. And I want to read something on the board, so I don't have to tell you with every single disorder, but there are 2 criteria that are required of every single disorder that we talk about. They're the last 2 criteria for every single one. And when I say criteria, they're the diagnosis information in the DSM. So there are 2 of them, and I'll put them up here. The first one is it must cause clinically significant distress or impairment. So whether it's anxiety or depression, schizophrenia, whatever it might be, it has to cause clinically significant distress or impairment. It's affecting your life in a significant way, right? It makes it hard for you to go to work. It makes it hard for you to pass your class. It makes it hard for you to do things. It interferes in your life in a clinically significant way, right? Every single one of us has anxiety to differing degrees, but every single one of us has some degree of anxiety, some degree of depression, some degree of everything that we're covering. So it has to be clinically significant in order to be diagnosable. The second one is it cannot be caused by the use of a substance or a general medical condition. So that's the second. So if it's caused by the use of a substance, so let's say that you take too many amphetamines and it causes anxiety. Technically, that's considered a substance-induced anxiety. We consider that a substance disorder because the substance caused it. Or if it's caused by a medical condition exclusively, then it's a medical issue, not a psychological issue. So those are two criteria for every single disorder. Can't be caused by the use of a substance or a general medical condition and must cause that clinically significant distress or impairment. So just so I don't have to say those with every single disorder, just know that those are true. I also want to mention that there's a very common psychology student phenomenon. I was so guilty of this myself, where as we go through these disorders, you're going to think that you have every single one of them, right? And that's so common. As we go through them, you'll be like, oh my gosh, I have panic attacks, I have phobias, I have OCD, I have this, I have that, I have a lot of issues, right? You probably have a little bit of every single thing that we're talking about. And I doubt that you have every single disorder. Most people have one, maybe two disorders, sometimes three, right? But one or two is the most common. There's no way that you have all of them. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through, that if you're feeling like you have each one of these, remember it has to be clinically significant and that you have to meet all these different criteria. So with that said, let's talk about anxiety and anxiety disorders. And I hope I don't offend anyone. I thought that was funny. Did I blow the candle out? I think I did, right? Kind of, we'll talk about OCD a little bit later. But anxiety is something that we all have. Okay? Anxiety is a feeling of fear or apprehension, but it's caused by something appropriate and identifiable, and it goes away with time. Okay, so it's something that's appropriate, it's identifiable, everyone experiences anxiety. I would argue that it would be abnormal to not have any kind of anxiety ever. An anxiety disorder is when you have extreme, unrealistic, or debilitating anxiety, clinically significant levels of anxiety. So let me give you an example, right? I'll be honest with you. The night before the first day of a semester, okay, so like that Sunday night before the Monday morning first class, I don't sleep like at all. I'm up, right? I'm up all night worrying about everything. I'm anxious about everything. Will the projector work? Will the technology work? Will my pants fall off mid-class? I don't know. I can come up with whatever, right? I'm nervous. I'm anxious about it. I don't know all of you. Some of you, a couple of familiar faces, which helps, but I don't know you. I don't know what's going to happen. Is something going to happen that day? Like I can obsess that first night. And I would say that's totally normal. My partner's a teacher as well. She teaches at Royal High School. And the two of us, like the night before our first semester, we just sit there and like stare at each other. Like we're both anxious and we have a hard time sleeping. But after the first week passes, that kind of gets a little bit better, right? Like I know what to expect from the classroom, right? I actually came here several times before the class started to make sure I knew how to operate everything and everything worked. I get used to all of you. I get used to everything and that anxiety subsides. Now, if 4 or 5 weeks into the semester, I'm still not sleeping every night before a class, I'm still feeling sick to my stomach before a class, I would say that I've transitioned down to here. Okay, so again, anxiety is normal, but when it starts to become extreme or unrealistic or affect your life in some way, that's when you go more toward like a disorder. And we'll talk about, there's a bunch of different anxiety disorders. We'll talk about some of the bigger ones, but there's a big difference between these two things that are up here. So the first one that we'll go over, GAD, generalized anxiety disorder. Somebody who has GAD or generalized anxiety has a bunch of prolonged, vague, but intense fears that aren't attached to any particular object or circumstance. So this person is kind of anxious and afraid of everything and nothing at the same time, right? It's not one specific thing. It's not specific. It's more generalized. So what we see with this disorder, so GAD, is a bunch of different symptoms, right? So this person has, and with every disorder, there's usually a duration piece. So for at least 6 months, you have 3 or more of the following symptoms. So usually there's a time duration that you have to meet and then a bunch of different symptoms. So one of them is you're on edge or restless. So you're constantly kind of on edge and restless. You have a very hard time relaxing because you're always anxious about whatever, right? This person, like, don't let the ceiling fall on my head tonight, right? Like, it's just every little thing is making you anxious and nervous and making it difficult to function. Because you're always worrying, you're also typically exhausted. So there's exhaustion. Or we could say that you get tired easily. Because all of your energy is going toward anxiety and worry, right? It's kind of dominating your life in a way. You have a hard time focusing. So you have poor concentration. Again, because you're worrying about all these things. So as you're sitting here, is my pencil going to run out of lead? Do I have enough paper? Will the battery on my tablet die? Right? Like, is the power going to go out? Like, it's just everything. And because all of that is on your mind, it's hard to pay attention and focus and concentrate on the things going on in the moment. You tend to have a lot of irritability. Oftentimes, because of all this energy that you're spending, you're irritable and you're cranky, right? Which may or may not be observable to other people. It might be something that's more internal. You tend to have a lot of muscle aches and soreness. When we are anxious or stressed, we tend to tense our muscles. And so you might have a lot of like muscle soreness and aches, where that's pretty common with this disorder. There's a very difficult time sleeping. Again, like this poor little guy in the picture here, you're laying there worrying about everything that could possibly happen. You start worrying about worrying in a way, right? It's called meta worrying, and it can just kind of get you in this loop that's very difficult to get out of. And then of course, those other two criteria that we talked about over there. But for at least 6 months, you have 3 or more of these symptoms. And the key is it's not one thing, it's everything, right? When we talk about specific anxiety or specific phobias, that's one item. This is across all circumstances and ideas. And so I have an example of this that I'll play for you. And I think it's a really great example. My kids are obsessed with this, the Netflix show of this, the Lemony Snickets, right? They like have watched it like 14 times. I've seen it so many times at this point. But this is from the movie, the series of unfortunate events. The character exhausting, right? To worry at that degree about every little thing is exhausting, right? And which is why it leads to things like poor sleep and muscle aches and all that kind of stuff. It just takes a big toll, but it's across all circumstances, right? I love this. It's not a sin either. My goodness, you must have worried yourself to death. It's just worrying and anxiety about everything. It's very rooted in negative thinking patterns, very rooted in the cognitive perspective, right? People have basic irrational assumptions about the world around them. So inaccurate or inappropriate beliefs about the world, right? And so a huge part of treating this disorder is doing what's called cognitive restructuring. It's a big part of cognitive therapy, where you try to change the assumptions and reactions to worry. Okay, so how likely is it that the fridge is going to fall? How likely is it that this is going to happen? How likely, is the ceiling really likely to fall on your head tonight? Like, let's talk about that and work through that. And so a big part of this is really examining those patterns, because people, as I said, get caught up in what's called meta worrying. You start to worry about the fact that you're worrying, which leads to more worrying, and it just goes round and round and round, and it's hard to get out of. And so by breaking that cycle through cognitive therapy, you can challenge those beliefs, and hopefully, like, it's again exhausting because you have to go through every little thing. But as you start to do it more, it's like checking the facts. What is the likelihood that this happens? If I do run out of lead right now, what's the worst that could happen? Maybe I don't have a pencil and I can't take notes, or I have to ask my neighbor if they have a pen or a pencil, right? It's kind of looking at those kind of scenarios and what could I do if it happens? Did you have a thought?
Yeah, when I was watching that scene, it's like, out of everything in the house, June mentioned once if the house is going to tip over.
I know, right? Because it's on like stilts and moving, right? The funny thing too, if you've watched the movie, is all those things do kind of happen at some point, but like, but that's not the point of like what I'm sharing, but yeah, right, there was a bigger concern there, right? But she doesn't mention that one thing.
I actually rewatched the movie too, because it's been 20 years.
It's a good, I think it's a good movie, right? They never made another one, but it was good. They made that TV series instead. And this guy here, Albert Ellis, I love that he's smiling because he's a really like kind of antagonistic guy. So it always makes me laugh that he's smiling here. But his idea was to really almost aggressively challenge people's irrational assumptions through therapy. Rational emotive therapy is a very common approach to this disorder. And I won't go as far to say you're shaming someone for those fears and worries, but it borders on it, right? It's like, well, that's ridiculous. Why would that happen, right? Kind of almost that level of a challenging. But the idea, again, is to challenge and change those irrational assumptions to hopefully lower some of the anxiety that people are experiencing. So one very common model here is the cognitive model, which is going to work on talk therapy, cognitive restructuring, challenging and changing those beliefs. We also tend to approach it from a biological model. Okay, so these are the two models that kind of explain this one the best. When people have a lot of anxiety, it's thought to be related to the neurotransmitter GABA. GABA plays a big role in anxiety, along with some others like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine and a whole host of things. They're all interconnected, but GABA is a big one here. And with GABA, if we believe that somebody has like an imbalance of GABA, low levels of GABA, then we can give them medications to help them calm down. And one of the most common types or groups of medications for this is a group of drugs called the benzodiazepines. The downside to these is they make people very sleepy. Very common to take these to help you sleep at night. These are drugs like Valium and Xanax. Right? Valium and Xanax are two very commonly prescribed drugs for people who can't sleep or struggle with anxiety. They're also very commonly abused. I see this all the time in movies. I'm sure if you, well, maybe you'll notice from here on out, but like if somebody in a movie takes a Valium or a Xanax, it's almost like they feel better instantly, right? They'll pop a Valium or a Xanax and they're like, God, I feel so much better. These drugs, most drugs, take 20 to 30 minutes to work. Okay, so if you feel better instantly when taking a medication, that's all in your mind. That's that placebo effect or that expectation. Because these drugs do take a little bit of time. They can also be very commonly abused if you combine them with things like alcohol. They can be very dangerous if you combine them with alcohol. And it tends to play a role in a lot of suicides. People combining the benzos with alcohol because it magnifies their effect. I always think of, I don't know if you've seen Bridesmaids, right? When she's hallucinating, like she's on the plane, she's anxious. Helen gives her what was probably a Valium or a Xanax. She's taking it with alcohol and it just makes it that much stronger. She starts hallucinating, acting really out of it. That's very common when you combine these drugs with alcohol, but they can be helpful in moderation for dealing with severe anxiety. Yeah.
That's similar to that is when house uses Vicodin.
Oh, Vicodin,
Right.
yeah, painkiller, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, very easy to abuse drugs when they have a very strong effect, right? Like you take a Vicodin and it removes pain. That's so reinforcing, right? That's negative reinforcement. And so what happens is you want to keep taking it, people can become addicted to them very easily. You can also learn to calm yourself down on your own. It just takes a little bit more effort. So we tend to teach something called relaxation training, where you learn to calm yourself down in stressful situations. So when you feel your anxiety rising, you take deep breaths. You focus on things like mindfulness, which we'll talk more about in the next chapter. Maybe you have a certain song. Like when I get really worked up, I have like a playlist of like relaxing songs, right? That I sometimes will listen to calm me down, right? So it could be breathing, it could be music, it could be mindfulness practices, but you can learn to have that kind of sedative effect on your own. It just takes a little bit more effort. So the essence with this one is, again, very vague, prolonged fears, kind of related to everything, cognitive and biological models for what causes it and how we treat it. Any other thoughts or comments here before we move on to more specific kind of anxiety? Anything here? Anyone, people in your life, stories, comments, thoughts, anything? Yeah?
Does Mexico count as one of those common?
Lexapro is an antidepressant, right? So it's much more commonly used for depression. We'll talk about it a little bit in chapter 6.
Okay.
But sometimes the antidepressants can be used for anxiety as well. So it can have some anxiety reducing properties. It's just not its like main way. You have your,
Yeah. I don't think it's like. I think what, it's like the. It's like you think, you try out and kind of blank out and forget your entire day, and it's like it's following amnesia or something. And, I don't know. Forgot.
well, so sometimes when people take like non-human Xanax, especially at a high dose, they can have almost like a dissociated property to it. When people enter that altered state, they might not have memory for that period of time. You're not lucid, right? Because you're on like a drug altered state. So yeah, forgetting or not having like a poor memory of events in that time is fairly common, especially if you're taking a
When somebody's like worried all the time about like the suffering, you know, disease or something, does that go in
in this category. So if it's only that you're going to get sick or like a disease or something like that, it's only one thing that falls more into phobias if we're talking about this, right? So this is lots of things, lots of vague fears. If it's one specific thing, specific thing that's most right? Which a lot of people developed during COVID, especially disease and sick as well. Very common, a lot of anxiety during that time. I don't know why it gives up on me if I don't look at it for like 3 minutes. Is that a stretch?
When someone gets scared of everything, so they get prescribed Xanax.
Yeah, but you'd have to be diagnosed with the disorder. So it has to have that, like, again, over 6 months, it has to be affecting your life in some way. So maybe it's making it hard to function at work or in school, or it's affecting relationships that you have. The key is that, again, it's affecting your life in some capacity. And if that's the case, then you would qualify for like medication if you have that diagnosis. So what they don't want, right, is like, because again, all these things are somewhat common. And so there's a time frame for every disorder. That's that duration of those 5 Ds. So the idea is that we don't diagnose everyone because some degree of it is normal, right? Only when it goes past a certain time frame or a certain intensity do we consider it a disorder. So that's kind of the idea, rather than having every single person ending up with these diagnoses by giving a time frame and an intensity, it minimizes that.
What are some of these like urgent
Needs.
medication or help in they're like 12 not 6 months?
Yeah, it could be tricky, right? And they might say like, you don't meet the criteria yet, right? And that's sadly, that happens, right? Let's say that you go into a therapist and you're like, I'm struggling with all these things. Therapists don't prescribe medication. So you have to go into a therapist, get a diagnosis, and then get into a psychiatrist or a medical doctor who will prescribe you the medication. It can take time, which is sad because a lot of people then struggle and they're in pain in that time, right? Yeah, it's unfortunate for sure. Just like anxiety and anxiety disorders, we all experience fear. I guarantee everyone in this room is afraid of something, right? Maybe more than one something. I definitely have a whole host of things that scare me. My poor daughter, Kaya, my oldest, has developed a new fear over the last 2 weeks. And I would almost say it's a phobia at this point of praying mantises, right? It came out of nowhere. Like this poor kid, we went out to dinner and she felt something in her hair and she went like this to grab it and it was a praying mantis. And she screamed and started crying. And we were at softball over the weekend and there was a praying mantis on her back and she freaked out. Like this poor kid is developing a phobia of these little bugs at this point. But everybody has things that they fear, right? Or that you would rather not encounter. Fear is a response to a threat. Okay, so there are a lot of things that are scary, right? You fall from the high enough height, it could kill you. Get bit by the wrong spider, could kill you. The wrong snake, whatever it might be. There are a lot of things in the world to be afraid of. Fear, if it's identifiable and appropriate, is normal. When it goes beyond those things, we call it a phobia. So when people have phobias, It's an intense paralyzing fear of something that's excessive and unreasonable. Okay, so it's beyond kind of typical and normal. So I will share with you, I have a horrible phobia of spiders. I hate spiders. Anyone else in here, not a spider fan? I'm the only one, a couple of you, that's good. There's lots of you who can get them if there is one in the room, then, right? But just thinking about it, like I can feel it, right? So when I was little, I can trace my fear of phobias back to like a preschool incident with spiders in the bathroom. Like if I think about it, I can trace it back. Doesn't help that when I was a teenager, I was bit by a brown recluse on my foot and almost lost my foot. A huge scar. I was first person in the Utah desert to be bitten by a brown recluse. Lucky me, on a backpacking trip. But I have a horrible fear of spiders. Where it becomes excessive and unreasonable, you know what spider scares me the most? Daddy long legs. They are not dangerous at all, but I hate them. And this building is filled with them. Oh my gosh, it's so awful. They're everywhere. I'm terrified of daddy long legs, and they're not even like scary, but that was the spider that kind of caused the phobia for me. So phobias tend to be beyond the typical, right? So it's so intense and excessive or unreasonable that you avoid situations. It causes fear when you just think about it. These tend to be very intense things for people. I have a video that I want to play for you. It kind of introduces this topic. The woman in here is afraid of feathers, like from a bird, right? So just to put that out there in case like that, but that's what a phobia can look like, right? They show her a feather and you see what happens physiologically as her body releases all those like hormones and neurotransmitters. It causes a very intense reaction for her, all right? And that is her response to, why does it keep doing that? A response to that feather. Yeah.
She saw a bird 300 feet away and left her daughter on the beach.
Yeah, right. Like just took off running and left her kid, right? And that is obviously a problem, right? That's the intensity of the reaction that she felt to seeing a bird or a feather, right? And so with these phobias, people have that very out of proportion reaction. So you have a significant or persistent fear, again, at least 6 months, right? So we have that criteria. And so this fear is out of proportion to what it should be. Okay, so you're reacting way more intensely than you should given the stimulus or given the item. When you're thinking about it or exposed to it, you have an immediate panic response. So you saw what that did to her with her heart rate, your palms start sweating, you breathe faster, you're scared. And it happens instantly. It could be even enough that just thinking about that item brings all of that up for you. You know and recognize that the fear is out of proportion. You know that it's irrational, but that's not enough for you to be able to stop it. And you avoid anything that might put you in contact with something that scares you, right? And so it's a very intense thing of one item. Now you can have more than one phobia, but it's one thing: birds, feathers, snakes, heights, right? Whatever it might be. Yeah.
It's like you really have to guess people's fears.
Okay.
And their phobias. And this guy brought out like cotton balls.
Yeah.
And I had no idea that could be even a thing.
Cotton
And
balls,
all
yeah.
of a sudden he just started throwing them until like the person moved and the lady like sprinted off. She said it was because of the texture and how it made her teeth feel.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Cotton balls, I've heard that many times, right? Again, it could literally be anything. Cotton balls. I had a student once who was terrified of earthquakes, right? And he said that his problem was whenever there was an earthquake, he would take off running, right? And so he's like, I have to sit in the front row because if we have an earthquake, I need to be able to run, right? And I'm like, well, that's not gonna help you. But he, like, you could see it. He spent his whole day worrying that there was gonna be an earthquake and he'd have to run out the door, right? And again, it could be literally anything, right? I have one of spiders, right? People have these of all sorts of things. My partner, it's lizards. So if there's a lizard in the house, I have to get it. Our cats sometimes bring in lizards as, you know, presents for us. So lizards, it's my job. Spiders, it's her job, right? Because we both have our things. Is anyone else in here, either yourself or someone in your life, phobias that you want to talk about there?
I was but when I was younger, I was really scared of being choked while I was eating. So I used to she like she kind of
Yeah.
disappeared. So
Sure.
I was eating long things because I didn't want to die, but it was like a really big fear.
Okay, and better now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, I had to get over because I'm eating all the time, so I
Mhm.
think that's why.
Well, and sometimes we do outgrow them, right? Like you can outgrow as well. Yeah, did you have one?
Everybody use like definitely afraid of moths and butterflies.
Okay.
So like more than any bug, lizards, spiders, we'll pick up spiders, we'll chase spiders,
Yeah.
cockroaches, but the minute you keep them off, like butterflies,
It's over.
and feet. Sure.
Yeah, and again, moths and butterflies aren't going to hurt you, they're not necessarily dangerous. But something in the way that your brain is wired and the way things have become connected to each other, you associate them with danger. Other people, yeah. Bees, yeah, okay, for you? Oh, she's like, yeah, me too.
If I hear something out here, why I think it could be, I'm like.
Okay, right, bees, okay, again, and they can be dangerous, right? It's not fun to get stung by a bee, right? But phobia a little bit more severe. Other people, anyone else? Could be people in your life too, if you don't wanna out yourself, yeah?
Lobsters.
Lobster, okay, right, other than eating them, right?
Yeah. I was just by them when I was like.
Yeah, okay,
Scary.
so you can trace it back to an event, and that's so common with phobias. If you think about the thing that scares you, oftentimes there's a root to it. Like a childhood experience is really common. There are a couple other, Tanzia,
When it started, that's what happens.
Uh-huh.
It was
ants,
there was ants in my house.
okay,
Got it. But now it's like.
you're looking for and waiting for them, right? Uh-huh. And again, right, ants aren't in themselves scary, but they can become scary, become phobic, yeah.
Like form phobia, where like I have like a minor phobia like ocean.
Ocean.
Like I love the ocean.
Yeah.
I go it all the time. But like once I get through it, like can't stand my heart rate other than just like get terrified. I think
Yeah.
it's the most fun thing, but it's also the most terrifying thing.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting is Jaws, the movie Jaws, is the #1 horror movie of all time that inspired so many fears of the ocean. Right, still to this day. Before that, it was Psycho. People were afraid to take showers, which is just funny if you watch the movie now, it's not scary at all. But at the time, it was terrifying. Sometimes there are generational fears that are very common, and the oceans are really common now. I mean, there's something kind of scary about it too. What was
Also,
that?
reinforcing the fear, I saw a shark, I seen a shark.
Yeah.
One day they had five, and like 5-foot leopard shark just swam out like that. Oh, great.
Yeah, that's not gonna help, is it? Not at all. Okay. Anybody else? Anyone else want to share? You or someone in your life? I have an awesome terrified of zombies, but and then what's funny is I don't know if any of you saw, there was a story, there was a zombie spider. I don't know if any of you saw that. It was like literally a spider that was reanimated, right? And I was like, oh my God, it's beginning, right? Like I totally had that thought in the back of my head of like time to stock up, time to barricade, I gotta get ready. And then I was like, wait, no, it's a spider. Of course it was a spider. It combined my two fears together. Zombie spider, let's just go for it, right? But it's so interesting how these fears can come out of nowhere, or be very linked to an event. Being linked to an event is super common, but you like, where did it go? You avoid anything that might put you in contact with it. And even just thinking about spiders, like my palms will get sweaty, right? If I think about it enough, right? So that tends to be really common. There's a whole list in your book. You can literally be afraid of anything, right? You can have a phobia of anything. This one's really common. Social phobia, it used to be called, now it's called social anxiety disorder. It's a very common phobia. A lot of people have social anxiety. They're afraid to perform in front of others. They're afraid to talk in front of others or eat in front of other people. It's enough that they gave it its own category because it does tend to be something that's so frequent among people. People tend to avoid that speech class. Now you can take it online. When I was younger, you had to take it in person. But really common to have social anxiety, enough that it's its own group. Phobias are typically caused by conditioning, right? You learn to associate two events with each other. And like I said, I can trace my fear back of spiders to when I was in preschool, right? In preschool, our bathroom was just filled with these daddy long leg spiders. And at one point, like I got stuck in there and they were crawling on me, and that created that phobia for me. It was like something I can trace back very clearly. Oftentimes people can trace back an event to an event that caused their phobia. It might also be modeling. Somebody else has a fear or a phobia, or you see it in a movie, right? Oftentimes people, when they're young, if children watch a movie too early, they might not know the difference between reality and fiction, and that can create phobias. It's a very common thing, right? So there were like generational things with this. Like I said, there was a generational fear of clowns that came out of, some of you were nodding, like, like you see that too early. My poor brother, I have two brothers, my youngest brother is terrified of Halloween. Like he hates the whole holiday. He hates the month of October. He hates trick-or-treating. He hates the whole thing. He's in his mid-20s and he's still terrified of Halloween because he watched the Scream movies too young. Right? Like he walked out and he blames me. He's like, you were watching it in the living room. There's a huge age gap between us. He's like, you were watching it and I saw it, now I'm terrified of Halloween and ruined it for me. Like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, right? But very common, you see something too young, you don't know if it's real or not, that can lead to a phobia, right? And again, generationally, we see like certain ones that are more common. We also have a predisposition towards certain fears, things that are dangerous, naturally dangerous to us, can often lead to phobias. As I mentioned, spiders can be dangerous, right? Heights, bees even could be dangerous, right? Like any of these things that could be dangerous, we're more likely to develop phobias of them. We're more wired to have that fear. Yeah.
What do people get phobia from, like, let's say someone has a phobia, they get really close to murder, I mean, would that, would that be like a standard phobia?
Yeah, I mean, that would be completely reasonable, right? And it could teeter on PTSD. What was that? Yeah, right. So you learn to have a fear because of an event that happens. You're associating those two things together. And it could be that it ends up being like a PTSD kind of event, because that's definitely a trauma. Or it could be a phobia, or it could be kind of a blend of the two. Yeah, I would say that's completely reasonable. You get in a car crash, right? And maybe now you're afraid to drive. Yeah.
You have like sexual clown phase where people were actually dressing as clowns in the movie.
Yeah, and then you become afraid of clowns because you associate the two together, right? It's very like, and I would say reasonable too, right? Did you, yeah.
I was just thinking that, so, phobia is something that, it's fear you develop. Or something that is not actually. Very universal.
It could be something that could actually hurt you too.
Yeah.
Right, but reactions you will see.
I was thinking that, I don't know, for women, we're walking the street ourselves. We're like, scared to get attacked or something, and it's not actually happening, but since it's something that's common right now, so it's not considered a fear, phobia, right? So I can put that with a like lecture, put together that with a lecture we read, because if it's something that's socially like acceptable, it's not a phobia anymore, just because it's happening in a bunch of different contexts. But if you think about it, like, there's no reason to be like scared of now, like, only so fast as people want. In the narrative, you know.
That's tricky though, right? Okay, so I would say that here's where the difference. So we're walking alone at night and you're scared. And you have like a healthy fear and awareness of your surroundings, but you're still out walking and doing things at night. Someone who has a phobia of that wouldn't walk outside at night. And wouldn't walk outside at night alone without like either other people or something to protect themselves with. Like, so it's the severity of your reaction that dictates whether it's normal or a phobia. Right? So someone with a healthy typical fear, you might be very hypervigilant, like you're aware of your surroundings, you're a little nervous, maybe your heart's pounding a little faster. Someone with a phobia of being out at night wouldn't go out, right? Or if they did, they would be so incapacitated that they would be able to. So it's more your reaction. You could have a phobia or a fear of the same thing. And there, again, are things that are very common. Like people now struggle with contamination and illness much more than they did 5 years ago. Right, post-COVID, or and we still have people like COVID still a thing. Once COVID hit, people's fears of contamination became much more common and normalized, but it's still considered a phobia based on your reactions. So even if it's normal as a culture, it can still be a phobia. So it's based on your reaction. Yeah.
Where with like separation anxiety, not with like an infant, but with children and their parents. I coach kids and I've seen a couple of them, they'll experience like their first death in the family or like somewhere. and all of a sudden they like will not let mom be out of sight.
Yeah.
Is that more like PTSD or is that phobia?
So there are disorders. There is a disorder called separation anxiety as a childhood disorder. But it could be a phobia, right? Where you start to fear the death of a loved one, or the loss of a loved one. And some of that kids go through phases of that. That's normal. So, when my dad died like 5-6 years ago, my kids, we went to his funeral all together, and like they had months of fear that we were gonna die. And I would say that's totally normal and expected as they're kind of processing what that means. But if it persists for a long time, that's why we have the timing, right? If it persists, then it could be a disorder that requires some talking through or treatment. And treatment can be as mild as just talking through it. But yeah, it's tricky. Like if it lasts long enough, it could be a disorder, or it could just be a normal reaction to an awful event. There's a couple of ways to treat phobias. There's the nice way and there's the intense way. And they're both very effective, and it comes down to personal preference. So one thing, so if we're talking about modeling, I'm sorry, if we're talking about conditioning, forgive me, two things that become paired together, we have to change that conditioning in order to change the reaction. Okay, so we can do that in a slow, gradual way called systematic desensitization, or we can do that in a massive, like head-on exposure that we call flooding. And it really, as I mentioned, is a personal preference. So systematic desensitization is when you slowly and systematically desensitize someone to something that they're afraid of. So you create what's called a fear hierarchy, and then you rate each item and you slowly work through them. So let's say that you're afraid of spiders, would be my fear of spiders. So you would create a list of like a hierarchy of what's the most like benign exposure to a spider. So maybe it's like a picture of a spider that your anxiety is pretty low. And what would be the highest item? Like tons of spiders crawling all over you, right? Would that maybe be the highest one? Or like holding a spider, like a tarantula. Yeah. Just thinking about that makes me want to be sick, right? That's all. But you would create that hierarchy, and then you slowly work your way up it. And it takes time. You condition it with breathing and calming exercises, and you work your way up through it slowly. Now, it takes a long time to do, but it can be very, very effective. You're basically reconditioning someone to not be afraid of that item. Or you can face it head on through flooding. Flooding is when you have a massive, intense exposure to something that scares you. And the thought is that if you could face a massive exposure, a normal exposure won't scare you as much. So if we take my spider example, maybe I have like a bunch of spiders crawl on me like Fear Factor style, and like I'm no longer afraid of one spider anymore. Or if you're afraid of heights, you go to the top of the tallest building you can find, and it's horrible and you cry and it's intense, and then your fear eventually comes down and you're okay with a lower exposure to those fears. You can do these things on your own. I had a student, oh, it was years ago at this point, who was afraid of heights and they went skydiving. That's an example of flooding, right? You face the fear head on. She's like, I'm either gonna die or I'll get over my fear of heights. 50-50, right? She came back, she was okay. She kind of became addicted to it. She's like, this is really fun. I'm getting over my fear and I find that I like it now. And so you can do this on your own, or you can do it through therapy. I have an example of what this looks like in therapy. And what you'll see is the guy is afraid of heights, okay? And he is really upset with this treatment. He swears, he cries, he's having a horrible time, but then you see it kind of start to come down and calm down for him. And that's the idea behind flooding. So let me play this for you again. This guy has a phobia of heights. Warnings, because you said bees. He's a beekeeper. There is a second in the beginning where there's like a scene of bees, just for a second. So I just want to warn you. What specifically about it? Is it like what happens after we die? Is it the inevitability of it? Like, so it would be that one would require a lot of like digging to figure out like what is the root of that fear, right? Is it because something happened in your family, in which case you would work through that event? If it is like just the inevitability of death, it might be focusing on life. And you know what, like none of us can control the fact that one day we're gonna die, right? And even just saying that is that there's a heaviness to that, right? It's hard to accept for everyone. And when we're young, we tend to completely be in denial of it. And so it would be a lot of like talking through and making sure we shift perspective. That's a tough one because you can't change it.
Yeah.
All you can do is change your perspective on time you have. And so that would probably be the focus of it, shifting that perspective, so that we can focus on it. But that's a tough one, because it's somewhat inevitable, or it is inevitable unless the spiders. The zombie spiders advance, right? I've been thinking about that, right? But so I have an example I want to play for you of Jackie, the one who was afraid of the feathers, facing them in therapy. But the idea with, and I'll play it next time for you, but the idea with flooding is that you face it. And again, you could do this on your own. It doesn't have to be massive. Like every time I put this slide up, I'm like, I could touch that spider if I wanted to, but I don't want to, right? And I totally could, like I could touch the spider and just look away because it's on my hand. But that's awful because it projects on me. Right? But it's like that level of facing it, and I can feel it. Like my palms are sweaty just from that, right? And that's like a very small level that you would do here. Flooding would literally be like letting them crawl all over me, and I'm pretty sure I would die. I'd have a heart attack. That'd be the end of me. If you ever see in the story, like I died by spider like exposure, right? And it's stuff like that, like that reaction, that physiological reaction tells you this like, and nobody, well, I don't say nobody, but probably very few people want spiders to crawl all over them. There's some people who probably are fine with that. I don't know why, but there probably are, right? But when you look at like that irrational fear, right, that's where we can fulfill it. So next time what we'll do, we'll talk about the other one a little bit more. Again, I have an example of Jackie, which is a little more gradual, but a tiny bit of flooding. And then we'll move on to talk about like panic attacks and OCD and those kind of things next time. So I will see you all on Wednesday.